Hi, this is Carrie, and welcome to Tandem Talks, a podcast meant to empower you to live your life your way.
And I'm Craig. Join us as we go deeper with entrepreneurs and their journey creating success in business and life.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Tandem Talks. We're happy you're here, and we're just so grateful to have Maddy Niebauer on the call. She is a local Madisonian, which I think you're a little bit in the outskirts like us, but we claim to be Madison, but in the area, in Dane County. I'm so excited to have someone in Wisconsin on the call tonight. And, Maddy, she's the founder and CEO of vChief, a virtual chief of staff servicing company. And she's been building that for a handful of years. It actually started as a side hustle. So we're really eager to dive into the details around that and how she's transitioned and really scaled it into something very significant. But she helps leaders, whether they're small businesses, nonprofits, startups, really help focus where impact can be made most, growing their business by helping match them with part-time chief of staff. So we're excited to dive into details. And Maddy, thank you for being on the show. We're excited to just hear a little bit about the genesis, if you want to kick off with like the cliff notes on even how your idea was sparked and how you led down the path of a side gig.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carrie. Excited to be here with you and Craig. vChief, I founded about 5 years ago, and it started, as you said, as a side hustle. So my full-time job was as a chief of staff at a large nonprofit called Teach for America. And amusingly, that's a role that I fell into. I was applying for a different job, went through all the interviews, and then at the end of the process, they were like, well, we're not actually going to hire for that role anymore, but here's this other role, being a chief of staff. And I was like, I don't even know what that means, but I like you, and that seems fun, so let's do it. And it turned into just the best job for me. It was a great mix of both sort of strategy and strategic planning, which I had been doing before, but also a lot of like day-to-day execution and implementation of projects, and just really supporting a leader to be the best leader that she could be. And I was really very lucky to work with an amazing leader who became a friend and a mentor. And so we worked together for about 4.5 years in that role, which I think is longer than anyone ever thought it would be. But I had twins, and it was just like at a good stage of life. And we just really worked amazing together. And then she left to start a new nonprofit, which we had both been working on. And I moved into a new role at Teach for America. And then after a few months, she came back and she's like, I just can't live without you in my life. Will you moonlight with me 5 or 10 hours a week, doing the same types of work that I was doing before, but just in this sort of side hustle capacity. So it wasn't actually a side hustle that like I sought out. It was sort of came to me and landed in my lap. But it was a great complement to what I was, doing in my full-time role. And I got to work with her again and be a chief of staff, which is something that I just missed. And so I did that for maybe 6 months or so. And at the time, TFA was going through a lot of transitions. And I was like, I think it's time to shift out of this work. And so it occurred to me, you know what? I bet there are other people like her who could use a chief of staff, but who don't have the budget or the workload to really need someone full-time in the role. And so why couldn't you have something like a virtual assistant model where a leader can say, I want 5 hours a week or 20 hours a week of a chief of staff, and then they can work with someone in that capacity. And it's funny because when I originally started it, I just thought, okay, I'll just be sort of an independent contractor and have 2 or 3 clients myself. Mm-hmm. And I think what I saw when I started that hustle and that networking, like, who can I work with? Like, the demand was just so clearly bigger than what I could personally do, that's when it sort of became, okay, what could this business be? And so that's sort of how we started.
Fantastic. So there's a lot of directions we can go here, but I think talk to us then a little bit about what your service is and what it does, because I'm curious, just for companies we're involved with, we probably need your services already. You're hired.
It's true. It's so funny.
Chief of staff is not like a normal job title in the corporate world, right?
Yeah.
I know it is in politics and stuff, but just walk us through a little bit what that is then.
Totally. And I think what's funny is a lot of people know it from politics. And so that's all that they think of. But it's actually becoming so much more popular in both the private sector and the nonprofit sector. And I think the role can look really different across organizations and across leaders. So I'll talk about some sort of themes, but it is so different across leaders because leaders need different things, right? And in some ways, it's a role that really complements the skills of the leader. So say, for example, you are a leader who's one of those like big picture ideas people, really excited about sort of setting a vision and direction, but really could use someone to help you figure out, okay, how do I bring that vision to reality? And what are the actual steps I need to take to sort of operationalize that vision? So types of work chiefs of staff do often involve things like strategic planning and project management, and sometimes helping support team management. And then it can, like beyond that, run a gamut of everything from sort of creating systems and processes, like leading team meetings and agenda setting, running big conferences. A lot of times there's communications involved, whether that's sort of teeing up emails for a leader or drafting PowerPoints to use in presentations. So it's a really wide range of things, but I think they all work with the aim of helping a leader really prioritize the things where they can have the most impact and be able to have someone who they can just say, okay, you deal with this, you deal with this, you deal with this. But it's someone more senior than, say, an executive assistant who is equally important, but that person is usually doing more like logistics, travel, expenses, things like that. And we are doing the more like strategic, need to go toe to toe, have a conversation, figure out the right steps for the organization or for the leader.
Makes a ton of sense. I think that's what my current role is with the firm. So I just didn't know it.
You didn't know you were a chief of staff?
Yeah, I guess I was calling myself the CSO, like chief strategic officer, but it's probably more chief of staff is a better phrase. So great. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. That must be really interesting. And let's maybe not go there as much now, but a dynamic process to figure out what that leader actually needs versus what they think they need, or give them what they need when they don't know what they need, right? Like I'm sure that I can see the smiles on your face because they don't always know, right? And then finding the right personnel. So you help match them with someone who can basically bridge those gaps for them. That's fantastic.
Yeah, exactly. So we are sort of a professional matchmaker, and I think we're really good at assessing both what are the like tactical needs that need to happen and the unspoken ones, like you mentioned, but also sort of the work style and the culture fit, and like how does this leader like to work, and then thinking about who from our pool of talent would be a good match for them.
Yeah. That is fun. Yeah, it's matchmaker for CEOs and owners.
It's fun.
Cool. So let's just dial back a little bit then. As you were getting going, I mean, I think a lot of people are excited about doing side hustles. Maybe they have something going like you did. They have like maybe a client, or they figured out how to create a little extra income. But scaling that now to where you're at. And you mentioned something to us, and I know you and Carrie have talked about this, about really using the business as a tool to create a great life, not the other way around. So I know you've had the opportunity to travel, dial your workload down to 5 hours a week, then as you're traveling around Europe or the world, and then dial it back up so that you actually have that level of autonomy, which I think a lot of people miss. So can you talk to us maybe just about some good steps that you took to like create that level of autonomy as you were growing your business? And I'm sure it didn't happen overnight, but I know our audience would be really curious to go into that.
Well, and it's funny because as I was making some of these sort of important decisions and thinking about launching vChief, I was actually in Costa Rica. I was still working for TFA at the time, but we worked remotely, right? So I could do it from wherever. So we're down there for about a month. And, I was just really thinking about like, what is the lifestyle that I want to have with my family? We had done some traveling abroad, but I knew we wanted to do more and bigger and longer trips. And so, for me, like I've always, that job was always virtual. And so I was like, I can do this job virtually. Any of us can do this job virtually, right? This was 5 years pre-pandemic. So not everybody was convinced that virtual work worked, right? But now there's a lot more converts. And so, that was sort of a founding tenet to vChief. I mean, it's in our name, virtual chief of staff, right? Like you can do this from anywhere. So that was sort of just a mindset shift, not for me, but like as I talked to potential clients about doing this work, they're like, how do you do that virtually? And I can tell them how we do it. Obviously, like I think for some chief of staff roles, like there are places where you do need someone in person, but sort of being virtual first, I think was one element. And then the other, in terms of being able to like dial up and then dial down the work, when I was starting the company, I was reading the 4-Hour Work Week. And I feel like so many people get so much out of that book in terms of just kind of stopping this idea of like trading your time for money, right? Which is what I was doing in the side hustle, right? I was working 5 or 10 hours a week and making that money. But I think the difference between like that kind of side hustle and a business that is scalable is not just trading your own time for money. For me and the business we lead, that's trading other people's time for money, right? And building a team and providing the service-based business. Other businesses, it might be like creating a product that you're then selling, right? But for us, that really allowed us to scope up. So in our earliest days, I was still a chief of staff to my former boss, right? And I kept her as a client for the whole first year of vChief. So it was about 1.5 years total because I started after I'd been with her for some period of time. Because I couldn't let her go, honestly. Like I just love her dearly. And I was like, I got to keep doing this. But then about 1 year into it, we were on a 6-month road trip in South America with my family. And I was like, I have to be on a call at 2:00 on a Tuesday when I'm supposed to be like driving through the Andes. And I'm like, this is not a line. Like I can't do this. And I think that's the nature of client service work. Like you're always sort of at someone else's beck and call. And so for me, that was sort of a wake up that like, in theory, I could keep supporting her, but I don't think it's doing a benefit either to her or to me, right? And so at that point, I transitioned her to a different consultant who she loved, and that was great. But, and that really allowed me to free myself up. But that was the only client that I ever took once I started vChief. Like everyone would come to me and be like, can I work with you? And I'm like, we have an amazing team of people who are just like me and equally talented. But I think that's one of the things that sometimes people struggle with when they're starting a consulting type business, because you're the one doing the hustle. You're the one who has the relationships, and therefore people want to work with you. So how do you shift that client's mindset to like, I have built this business full of equally amazing people and you would be great with them, right? And I think for me, just holding a hard line in the beginning and being like, I don't actually do client work, didn't let it bleed into other things, right? So I wasn't getting sucked into the client work, which really allowed me to be able to, find the talent, do the hiring, do the vetting, like do all these other pieces of the business, and obviously like finding clients, which is the biggest piece of work when you're just getting out of the gates.
Yeah. And there's a psychology behind that too, though, because when a client says, I'd like you, well, obviously you started the company, you've done it, you're good, or that you have a skill. So how did you learn to let go of that and like sync them with other people where you're like, I think they can do it, but they're probably at 80% or not? Because it's easy to have that in your mind. Like, hey, I am the person who can do this the best. So therefore I should do it, versus let me even do 80% effectiveness and have somebody else do all of it. And I'll get 20% of the revenue and multiply it by multiple transactions. Right.
Yeah. Honestly, I think it was two things. I think it was just a mindset setting out. And honestly, it felt really risky in the beginning, really, really risky because, right, like if I'm doing all the work, I make all the money, right? Whereas if someone else is doing the work, I'm making a much, much smaller cut of that. But it's sort of like, okay, but then you spend your time growing the business. So honestly, I think that was like one of our key things to success. And I give all the credit to my husband, who was just like, actually, if you want to grow this, you need to not be doing more client work. And I was like, that is a very good point. He has some great wisdom he brings to the table. So I think firstly, it's sort of a mindset piece. And then I think secondly, it's really about being able to bring the talent on your bench that you are equally confident in, right? And so a lot of the people who we first hired were people who I knew or people who like were in my network. And it's funny because actually we've almost never posted this job anywhere. Like I've mentioned on LinkedIn, okay, like we'll bring on new chiefs of staff, but like we've never put it like a job post out to the world. Just in the past like 3 or 4 months, we've started that because we're like scaling so fast. We've, decided we needed to like just sort of expand the types of profiles that were coming in the door, but we still get like so much organic candidate traffic just from people who know people who either work with us or clients or whatnot, right? And so having trust in the people who I was placing and also being that like behind the scenes person, like, okay, if you have a problem, come to me, let's brainstorm, we'll talk it through, whatever. So back then I was just very day to day in the weeds with clients, right? And so we had this one project that wasn't going great. I ended up having to transition consultants in the middle of it because someone was having kind of a personal crisis that meant they couldn't really do the work that they needed to. And so I ended up like half managing that project, but with someone who, was ready to lean in and do a great job. So since then, I have pulled back a little and tried to get less involved in the weeds of the clients. And we are trying to think through as we get bigger and bigger, right? It's one thing to like lean in when you have 20 clients. Right now we have like 75 clients. I could see us, having 2 or 3 or 5 times that many. I can't be the one who's like, let me problem solve for this like engagement issue, right? So we're thinking about structurally as an organization, is that something that the business development folks hold because they have the relationship with the client, or do we create like a customer support or client success kind of role? And those are like the bigger strategic questions that we're asking ourselves now. But at the time, it was a lot of like, let me just solve this problem and make everybody happy.
Yeah. Well, and hats off to you because you were willing to do it, but then you were also you've been willing to strategically let go over time and continuing to do that, it sounds like.
Yeah. It's always a struggle. I'm a problem solver by nature. And I'm like, well, let me just figure this out.
Let me just jump in there with you. Right. I think it's just so fascinating when you think of like building organizations, and you even referenced one of your chiefs of staff having a personal issue and just how that then translates into affecting your business in so many ways. And like having a qualification process or really high standards for the people you take on. It's a lot, right? And I think most of us weren't born with like impeccable leadership skills or amazing communication skills. I know for us, those are things we've really had to work hard to develop as we've worked with a lot of business owners. But can you speak to that journey a little bit from your side? Like I'm guessing your first year, that looked different than now 5 years later. But like any picture you could paint on the evolution would be empowering for people.
Yeah, I think for me, as I thought about sort of my own professional development as a leader, there's a few different things that I have done and I have thought about. I think, initially, there's just so much to learn about running a business, right? Like I didn't know the first thing. I'm like, accounting, like we need insurance. Like there's all these things that I'm like, I don't know. And so there were a lot of great resources, here in Madison. Doyen is like a women's and entrepreneurs networking group. They provide a lot of training and different things. And so that was a super helpful resource to me. And I know there's a lot, all over the country, there's these types of organizations that help new entrepreneurs figure things out. So that was one piece. And then I worked at a co-working space called 100 State, which was an amazing sort of opportunity to network with other entrepreneurs and learn from them and sort of problem solve, like, oh, I have this thing, like, what should I do? How should I think about it? And then I think another really big piece for me and my growth as a leader is working with an executive coach. So it's funny because I had a coach who I was working with as I transitioned out of Teach for America. And I already knew what I was going to be doing, but TFA was sort of offering this thing for people who are transitioning out. And I was like, well, I'll just talk to her and maybe she'll have ideas on how to market my business. Well, it turns out she was also launching her own sort of leadership consulting or coaching practice. And I became her first sort of formal client. And she was just someone who helped me think about my own leadership, doing sort of different assessments and things and thinking about, what are my strengths that I can lean into and what are some of the areas that I should be thoughtful or careful about. But she was also someone who I just called when I was like, oh my God, this is what's going on. Like, help me brainstorm. How do I problem solve this like crisis of the moment? And it was so amazing to just have someone in your court, who was like both your cheerleader, but also the person who is like helping you think about how to, grow and develop as a leader. And that has been just a huge, huge boon. I love her. And I have sent a lot of people her way because I'm like, she has helped me so much.
Yeah. Well, and it sounds like in one of the more vulnerable, like times of your life when you're completely changing directions in a sense, and navigating new challenges you haven't problem solved before. And I think what's hard is for most solopreneurs, when they think about being a business owner, they really think about being on an island and like, rolling up their sleeves on their own. But I don't know any successful business owner that could really say that they like built it by themselves. I love how you talked about like getting into the community and accessing probably some free resources, some paid resources, actively networking to find good people who could help you strategically, but also emotionally. And just someone who's like gone the course and can be like, oh yeah, that sucks. Like, I get it. That's hard. Or yeah, you should definitely go that way versus that way. I mean, you can't put a price tag on what that level of support system can play in someone's success long-term. Or if you'd be here today, if you didn't have that. I mean, we can say the same about our journey. So I think for anyone listening, just taking like kind of extreme ownership over building that team or that community around yourself. And my mantra is always like more help is usually better than less help, especially if it's qualified and you vetted the help and you feel good about it. But I love that aspect of the journey because it's so often, I think it's less the strategic stuff that trips people up, but more like the life stuff in so many ways, the emotions of it all.
Well, yeah. And like you have that person that you could lean on, but when that person is your sister or your mom and they've never built a business, it's like, it can be catastrophic because now you're going inventing like, oh, it's so hard. I know. And they're like inflaming your issues where a coach will listen, they can empathize because they've been there, but then they'll also be like, yeah, but get off your butt and do these 3 or 3 things. And it's like, right? Yeah. It's a totally different experience than like your best friend who you grew up with. And now you're going to go have coffee and complain about your company. It's like, it's not a good way to elevate. It's not a good way to elevate. And it's the mistake we see a lot of people make, which you did.
Yeah, no, I think there's something to be said about like building that like network of other entrepreneurs around yourself and the people who are doing the same thing and having the same struggles. And there are several people who, have been kind of on this peer journey with me building organizations. And, I think we're both great thought partners for each other and someone who you can complain to, but also who will give you concrete ideas too. I think it's really helpful. And it's been fun as I've gotten farther along because now people are turning to me as sort of a mentor and being like, what are your ideas about how I grow this business? And I'm like, let's have a conversation about money because nobody ever talks about money and how much you're charging things. And people who do that for me in the early days, I was like, oh, okay. Like that is something helpful that a lot of people are like shy about. And I'm always grateful when people are like, okay, no, let's get real.
Yeah. One of our chapters in our book is about decision making and, learning how to price yourself and all that. And we felt very passionate about that chapter. It was the hardest one to write. Well, they were all really hard to write, but that one in particular was tough. But ultimately, business ownership is just one decision after another and solving one problem after another. I mean, constant problem solving. So I love that you speak to that. But I think the bigger question is like, any tips for the aspiring entrepreneur on like how to become stronger in decision making and problem solving? Like, were there major mindset shifts you had, or have you always been like that? Or, how have you grown that muscle? Because I do think it's a skill you can develop, but it sounds like you are also likely very talented in some ways in that area of your
Well, I think like for me, as much as you can be sort of data driven in your like decision making, right? Like no one wants to make an uninformed decision. And it's like, I mean, you can't always go and get tons of data, but even if it's just sort of like benchmarking and seeing what else people are charging for a similar service, or talking to people who have done the thing, or surveying your potential customers, or, you know, whatever else that will give you the information to drive the right decision, right? And I think that helps. I mean, that's not to say I have never made the wrong decisions, right? Like there's lots of things that if I could do it over again, probably I would do it differently. But I think having both like an informed framework to make the decision, and also like knowing when to get input from others, like as the CEO and the founder, like at the end of the day, the decisions lie with me, right? But I want to consult and be informed by all the different stakeholders that are involved in things, right? And sometimes I'm like, gosh, this is a really tricky situation. I just want input from people. And now we've grown to a size where like I have a team who I can talk to about things. Before it was just like, call Jackie, my executive coach, and be like, what do I do? But it's nice to be at a place where I can help drive those decisions. But now what I think is interesting is we're getting to the stage of organization that like other people need to be making decisions, and I can't be involved in every decision. Right. How do I pull myself up and out of that and empower other people to drive those decisions? And I know there are some tools that we have used with our clients that are sort of decision-making frameworks, like who owns the decision, right? Who is consulting, who has veto power, whatever. And I think those can be really helpful as people get bigger and have other people that they have to, you know, both empower and get input from on decisions.
Yeah, definitely. And we talk about it like this, the decisions never stop. So it's just like a constant barrage of like next decision, next decision, next decision. And it always feels like, oh, when I make this one, then I'll have like some clear runway. And it's like, not if you're growing, because then you have to make all the decisions that come with growth, right? Yeah.
I have this moment right now where I'm like, oh, as soon as we hire that person, then all the dominoes will fall into place. And I'm like,
right.
No,
right.
There will be some other thing that needs to also fall.
Then there's just more dominoes, right? But I also think there's a place where you can get to where we've gotten to a certain businesses or revenue streams where you can coast a little bit more if you're not in an aggressive growth mode, right? If you're just maintaining, then that's very different than. And I think that's important back to what, you know, how do you want to live, and like what we would call a life vision, where it's like, well, is it really important that you build $100 million business, or could you do fine with a $2 million business that produces X income, right? So I think that's where knowing yourself and what's valuable is super, super clutch, which it sounds like you've found some balance, and you're still in a growth phase. So nothing.
Yeah. Well, I think what's interesting, so we've been around for 5 years, and I have, I reflect on it, like the first 3.5 years, I think we're largely, I wouldn't say coast mode, like it was still a lot of hustle in the early days, but there were large periods of time where I was like, okay, the only thing I personally am doing is what is absolutely required to keep the lights on, right? Because we also took a 6-month trip in Asia where the time difference is ridiculous. Like I was on calls at 5 a.m. and 11 at night, right? But I'm like, I don't want to be working very much. Like I want to go and enjoy Asia and do the thing. And what was great about that was it was such a good forcing mechanism for me to just offload as much as I could off my plate. So I became the last step in every process. Like, yes, I looked at the finances. Yes, I like interviewed all the talent. I talked to all the clients, but I made other people do it. So I only talked to the clients who were like ready to sign up, basically. Yeah. Like, someone else still dealt with all of that. And that has continued, right? Like even when we came back and I had more time, but what was nice about being freed up from those things was then I could spend more time on like things that would drive growth. So it was a super helpful forcing mechanism, but it also like during that time of our life, I was fine with the company not growing like crazy. I was just like, this is great. Like we're making plenty of money. Like the business is running well. We're like building the systems and things that it's much more automated. And then like come time, nobody's doing anything, right? So we're just hanging out at home. I'm like, okay, well, like, let's just invest more time and energy into growing the business. And I think it just kind of aligned with like a time I was ready to do that anyways. And then, started building the team that helped drive that growth. But it's funny because right now I'm like, it's not that I want to take a step back, but I want to like grow the internal team so that I can play a new role again, right? Like, I don't want to be the one who has to look at the finances every month. Like, yes, glance over them, but do I really need to like make sure all the invoices are right? No, somebody else can do that. Or like, do I need to be the problem solver for all the client things? Or do I need to talk to every person on the team and talk to all the clients? So we're kind of in that transition phase where like other people are starting to own all of that. And then I will spend more of my time just like high level management and then sort of externally facing brand building, marketing, et cetera. So I'm excited for that sort of chapter 2 to come. We're kind of halfway through it, but it has been interesting to sort of watch where I've dialed up and dialed back and be able to do it on my terms. Right. So
right.
Fun.
Totally. Well, congrats on that. Cause that's not something that a lot of people are able to pull off, like, quite frankly. So I want to transition just a little bit because I think what'll be an interesting question. So you've run a company, you've built one from scratch. I think you said you have 75 clients now, right? So that means you have at least like 75 virtual assistants or 75 companies you're supporting. That's fantastic. Yeah. You definitely aren't doing all of those yourself for sure. Yeah, or any of them in your case. But so you built your own business. And then now you've gotten to see the inside guts of a lot of businesses and CEOs and companies. So I'm sure you've seen some patterns, and we're big fans of kind of like identifying patterns for people. Like, what are some of the bigger mistakes that you see companies make, or more common mistakes that you see these businesses make, and that probably your chief of staff comes in and cleans up in a lot of ways, or hopefully cleans up, right? Or identifies like, hey, you've got this issue. But like, what are maybe the top 2 or 3 things that come to your mind in terms of like those kind of problems? Because I think there's a lot of side hustlers, maybe they have scaled to a decent level and now they're stuck or frustrated with certain aspects, right?
So I think there's a couple things. I think first and foremost is like having a vision for where you can go, right? And really figuring out what is like your unique value add as a leader to get to where you want to go, right?
Right.
You don't have to do all the things to make your business run. Like you are specifically gifted at doing some things that will get you to that vision point, right? Yep. And what can you give away to other people, right? And so some of our clients really struggle to give things away. They're like, I will talk at you for an hour about all these things that I don't want to do and I want you to do, but then I can't let them go because I am either, like, I don't want to say a control freak, but just like, I feel such strong ownership, I can't let it go, right? So I think figuring out how to delegate and automate things is incredibly important to a leader, and figuring out where they can have the biggest impact towards getting to that vision, whether that's a lot of growth or, whatever they want for their life and their business. I think the second thing is not creating systems that are designed for growth, right? And we are just as guilty at this as our clients. And we're trying to think now, like, what if we're 10 or 20 or 50 times bigger? Like, will this system work? Right. And that can be as simple as like using a CRM system instead of using a Google tracker for a Google sheet for your contacts or whatever. Right. And some of those systems are like more of a pain in the neck in the early days, but they'll pay off. Right.
Or more costly too. Like they can be, you buy it and then you got to,
Right. And it's like both like the cost of the system and the cost of like both your time and your team's time, like doing it. And so I think it's like a little bit of a fine line between like, what is my solution for now? Because sometimes you just need the solution for now. And what is the solution that will get me to where I want to be? And where do you make that shift, right? Mm-hmm. Like right now, we have a lot of systems that work for us, but probably we need to transition to this more of a bespoke solution that someone creates for us and embeds into our website, right? But that feels like both a big investment and a big change, and like, when's the right moment to do that? And I think those kinds of decisions can be tricky as people are going from that, like, we have a successful small side hustle, to like, I actually want to build an organization and a company around this.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a huge, well, actually both of those are fantastic.
Yeah.
And anything else? Cause I feel like you could probably tee off for a long time on this one. And if nothing comes to mind, that's fine. But I'm just really curious as to what you see that you're constantly having your chiefs of staff handle probably.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think the other thing is like having the right people on your team, right? Like nothing is harder than dealing with sort of personnel issues, whether it's like there is a culture that is not working well and like what is causing that culture not to be working well, and making some hard decisions about if there are people on the team who shouldn't be there or whatever. Like I think leaders often have a hard time being like, this is a problem, I need to solve it now. Like this is poisoning the water for whatever, right? So I think just having the right people and in the right roles is not always easy in the early days. Because in the early days, you're just like, I just need somebody to help. And I'm not going to spend forever looking for the exact right person for this thing. But if you have someone who's not quite right for whatever, like either they don't have the right skills or they're not a right like culture alignment, sort of solving that problem sooner than later is hard for leaders, right? Because nobody wants to let people go, right? That's not a fun part of the job. But sometimes that's what you have to do to like keep the culture what you want it to be and get the right person doing the right work.
Yeah. And keep growth and keep the company rolling, because you can't be nice to someone and then bankrupt the company in the process. Like, yeah, that's more detrimental than just letting someone go.
Yeah. But it's hard, right? Because you're always like, well, is this a trainable thing? Is it like, I am to a fault, like we can coach someone through this. But I've also seen, I mean, especially when you're in client service, like you're just like, either this is working or it's not working. And if it's not working, like we're not going to have you on this client anymore, right? It feels different than like the internal sort of like, we need to make sure. Yeah. It's tricky.
Makes sense. Well, thank you for these insights. I'm sure you have a long list of that last question that I asked that we could keep mining for. But we're big believers in just like, again, using your business as a tool to create a great life and staying close to like what matters most and not getting lost in the hustle of side hustling or running a business and then forgetting like you have a family, you have health, like those things are relevant. And how to really use it to complement and create a great life. And so look forward to getting to know you better. I think I probably have about 3 or 4 referrals for you based on what you've currently shared. So we'll stay in touch. Yeah, Carrie, you want to bring us home at all?
Yeah. Well, and Maddy, when we had initially talked, I think I just felt so connected in terms of your outlook and the way you're living your life and just this overall like unconventional way of doing things. You know, traveling with your kids abroad for months. And I know we talked about like the educational system and how to do that. And I just love that you're non-traditional in that way. And in terms of maybe casting a vision for the audience, I would love to hear like a cool travel story or maybe a vision for something you're going to do in the future. But anything that you think.
Yeah, I'll tell a funny travel work story, and then I'll talk about vision for the future. So there was a time I was in Vietnam and we were staying in this like kind of small boutique hotel that didn't have a ton of space, right? And so we were all in one room with our kids. It was like the Vietnamese New Year, so there wasn't a lot of like rooms. So we're like, let's all just cram into this room. So I had a call. I was supposed to be on this panel at like 5 a.m. because it was like 2:00 New York time or something. To talk about the chief of staff role with a bunch of people at the Wall Street Journal, I think it was. I don't even remember what it was for. Sort of like someone I was networked with was like, I want you to talk to these people. But it was like kind of a big audience, so I wanted to not be an idiot. So I'm like, okay, where can I do this call? Because obviously it's 5 a.m, I'm not doing it in my room. So I go downstairs, but it's pitch black. I can't, and it's like this open space it's like sort of where people eat breakfast, but it's not enclosed, right? It's just sort of just an open but covered. And I can't find the light switch, so I can't turn the lights on. And I was like, geez, what am I going to do? So I set my computer up hoping that like the light from the thing would be light enough for people to see my face. It was not. So then I set up my phone and I put it here and I put the flashlight on, like shining in my face. I'm talking. And I don't know if you can tell
solving,
this,
by the way. Yeah.
but I'm like a very animated talker. And so I'm talking to this group and I'm sure I was not quiet, and it was 5 a.m. And so at some point, like 10 minutes into this, there's someone who came down who I think they were either speaking like Dutch or German or something. And they were trying to communicate, like, shut the hell up, we're trying to sleep. And I'm like, hang on just a second, guys. And so then I like talk to them, and then I come back and I have to talk like this. Oh God, it was so hilarious. And it all worked out fine. But it was just one of those awkward, like, trying to travel and work and problem solve in the moment. But
You're trying so hard. You're trying so hard to make it all work. Let your kids get their sleep. Yeah.
It's hilarious. And as for future plans, we have tentatively signed up for a world schooler tour of Egypt in January, although all this Delta variant is making us be like, we'll see. Obviously, like, the kids have to be vaccinated before then, which is an unknown quantity too. So we'll see if that happens. But it's a friend that we met, a world schooling family that we met and we traveled with for about a month in Bali a couple years ago. And they are now organizing tours to places. And they did this tour in like 2019 with a bunch of families. And they had these videos of them all, like, both like, you know, walking around the pyramids, but also like swimming with dolphins in the Red Sea and all. And I was like, I'm sorry, but I have to do that. So we'll see if it pans out, but that would be amazing.
I love it. I feel like maybe your next project on the road should just be compiling all of your itineraries into a book form.
There you go.
Right?
I feel like that would be really cool to get my hands on.
We could pick that up.
That's our next side gig. I love it.
Yes.
You know, always plotting.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you speaking to that and, you know, hearing a bit about your home life and the dynamic, and it all really stemming from that vision and how you've protected your time and being willing to relinquish some control and delegate and automate. A lot of business owners have a hard time with that. I know us in phases as well.
Definitely.
So, you know, you talk about you're teaching that to a lot of the business owners, but you're also living it as you've scaled, you know, vChief yourself. So just so much integrity and such a neat example. And I hope the audience got a lot of really good notes. I know Craig and I both wrote down some things over here. So we appreciate you having you on. And as always, everybody enjoy the grind. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the day. Take care.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to today's episode.
Please subscribe and leave a review, and be sure to visit tandemconsulting.co/talks.